The lantern sputtered its last breath of oil just as the first wolf howled somewhere deep in the pine-black darkness of the Colorado Rockies, and Mary Quinn realized with a cold, sinking certainty that she was going to die out here on this mountain. She stood perfectly still for one terrible moment, holding the dead lantern in both hands like it might somehow resurrect itself through sheer willpower, while the October wind came screaming down the ridge and cut right through her wool coat as though the fabric were nothing more than cheesecloth. The darkness was absolute. Not the soft, familiar darkness of a bedroom with moonlight bleeding under the door, but the ancient, indifferent darkness of wilderness that had existed long before any human being had ever set foot in these mountains, and would continue long after the last one departed. She could hear the trees groaning above her, could feel the ground beneath her boots angling sharply in a direction she was no longer entirely certain was the way she had come. It was October of 1873, and Mary Quinn was 24 years old and completely, devastatingly lost on a mountainside in Colorado Territory. She had arrived in the town of Elkhorn Crossing 3 weeks earlier, riding the stage up from Denver with 2 trunks of belongings and a letter of employment in her coat pocket. The letter was from a man named Gerald Ashworth, who had advertised in 3 different newspapers for a schoolteacher willing to relocate to a remote mining community in the mountains above the Arkansas River Valley. Mary had answered the advertisement because she was the kind of woman who read the entire newspaper, including the small print sections at the back, and because the life she had been living in Cincinnati, Ohio, had reached a crossroads that no longer offered any comfortable paths forward. Her mother had passed in the spring, leaving Mary alone in a boarding house room with enough money to last 8 months and a teaching certificate she had earned 2 years prior. The school where she had been employed closed its doors when the building burned down in August, and the men who ran the 3 other schools in Cincinnati made it politely but firmly clear that they preferred male instructors for their permanent positions. The advertisement for Elkhorn Crossing had seemed, at the time, like a door opening in a wall she had been pressing against for months. Elkhorn Crossing was smaller than she had imagined, but it was alive with the particular energy of a place that believed in itself. There were 340 souls in the town, give or take the miners who came and went with the seasons, and they had built themselves a proper main street with a general store, a telegraph office, a church, a doctor's surgery, and the school where Mary was now employed. The children were bright and rough-edged and hungry to learn, and Mary had taken to them immediately with the fierce, uncomplicated love of a woman who had always been born to teach. Gerald Ashworth was the mayor and the owner of the largest mine on the eastern slope, and he had been perfectly courteous to Mary from the moment she stepped off the stage. He arranged her lodgings with the widow, Mrs. Carmichael, who had a spare room she rented out and made exceptional biscuits, and he paid Mary's salary promptly on the 1st of each month without quibbling. Everything about Elkhorn Crossing had seemed, for those first 3 weeks, like the beginning of something good. Then one of her students, a 10-year-old boy named Thomas Beale who lived with his father 2 miles up the northern trail, had not come to school for 4 days running, and none of the other children knew why. Thomas was one of Mary's most dedicated pupils, a quiet boy with serious dark eyes who was working his way through a reader 2 years above his age level, and his absence nagged at her in a way she could not dismiss. She had asked Mrs. Carmichael, who told her that Thomas's father was a trapper and was known to sometimes take the boy out of school for days at a time when the trapping was good. She had asked the shopkeeper, who shrugged. She had asked Mayor Ashworth, who told her not to worry herself about it. Mary Quinn was not a woman who did not worry herself about things. On a Thursday afternoon when the other children had gone home and the school sat empty, she had made the decision that she would walk up the northern trail herself and check on Thomas Beale. She left a note for Mrs. Carmichael on the kitchen table, took the oil lantern from its hook by the school door, put on her warmest coat, and started up the trail at 3:30 in the afternoon with the absolute, unshakable confidence of a woman who had never spent much time on a mountain and did not yet understand what that meant. The trail had been clear enough in the afternoon light. She had followed it for 1.5 miles without difficulty, noting how the pines thickened on either side and the ground became rocky and uneven, feeling the altitude in her lungs in a way that was interesting rather than alarming. She had found the Beale cabin and discovered that Thomas was suffering from a chest cold that had kept him in bed, and his father, a weathered man of few words, had looked genuinely startled to see a schoolteacher standing at his door. She had left him with the promise that Thomas could take his time returning, and that she would bring his lessons to him if he remained ill much longer. The walk back had begun simply enough, but the sun moved faster than she had accounted for, dropping behind the western peaks with a speed that seemed almost punishing, and the trail that had been perfectly obvious in daylight became something far more ambiguous in the gathering dusk. She had lit the lantern while she could still see the wick, and it had burned steadily for a while, and then it had begun to gutter, and then it had gone out entirely, and now she was standing in the full dark of a Colorado mountain night with a dead lantern in her hands and no earthly idea which direction would take her back to Elkhorn Crossing. She made herself breathe slowly and think clearly, the way her mother had always told her to do in a crisis. She could not stay where she was. The temperature was already dropping sharply, and she had no matches, no food, no water, and no shelter. Moving downhill seemed logical, since the town sat in the valley, but the ground around her seemed to pitch and roll in every direction, and she could not trust her sense of which way was truly down. The wolf howled again, closer this time, and a second voice answered it from a different direction, and Mary Quinn decided that standing still and waiting to be found was not a viable strategy. She took one careful step forward, then another, testing the ground with her boot before she committed her weight, and that was when she walked directly into something that did not give. She bounced backward with a startled gasp, nearly dropping the lantern, and then a large, warm hand caught her arm just above the elbow, and a voice came down out of the darkness above her, low and steady and utterly unhurried, like a man who had never in his life been surprised by anything. "Careful now. Ground drops about 6 feet, not 4 steps to your left." Mary spun toward the voice and could just make out, as her eyes adjusted to the darkness, the shape of a very large man standing about an arm's length away. He was tall, considerably taller than most men she had met, and broad through the shoulders in a way that suggested he had spent years doing work that made ordinary men's efforts look modest. He wore a heavy elk-hide coat and a dark hat that shadowed his face, and he was carrying a proper oil lantern that burned with a steady, generous flame that made Mary want to weep with relief. "Who are you?" she managed, and was proud that her voice only shook a little. "Caleb Holloway," the man said, as if that were an entirely sufficient explanation. He lifted his lantern higher so the light fell across his face, and she saw a man somewhere in his early 30s, with strong, angular features and dark eyes that caught the light and held it, and hair that was darker than the surrounding night and fell just past his jaw. There was a jaw on him that could have been carved from the same granite as the mountain they were standing on, and a calm about him that was not cold but was simply deep, the way still water could be deep without giving any indication of it on the surface. "I am Mary Quinn," she said, because it seemed important to establish herself as a person rather than a problem. "I am the schoolteacher in Elkhorn Crossing. I was visiting a student and I lost the trail coming back." "I know who you are," Caleb Holloway said. He was already moving, turning slightly, the lantern swinging in his hand. "I heard about you from Frank Beale when he came down for supplies last week. He said the new schoolteacher had come to check on his boy. You know Mr. Beale?" "Known him 12 years. He glanced back at her over his shoulder, and she could see in the lantern light that he was assessing her with a directness that was not unkind, but was entirely unvarnished. "Can you walk, or did you twist anything coming through the dark?" "I can walk," Mary said firmly. "I was not injured, I was merely lost." Something shifted at the corner of his mouth that might have been the beginning of a smile, though it did not fully commit. "Being lost on this mountain in October at night is injury enough," he said. "Follow close behind me. Stay exactly where I step. This part of the slope is unstable and the trail cuts back and forth 3 times before it straightens." Mary did exactly as he said, and Caleb Holloway moved through the darkness with a sureness that was almost unsettling to watch, as if the mountain spoke to him directly through the soles of his boots, and he was simply listening and translating. His lantern light spread out before them in a warm gold circle, and within that circle, Mary could see the trail emerge from what had looked like undifferentiated terrain, could see the roots and rocks and drop-offs that had been invisible to her minutes before. "How did you come to be up here?" she asked, because the silence between them was comfortable enough, but she was a woman who thought in words and needed them the way other people needed air. "I live up here," Caleb said without looking back. "My cabin is another half-mile east. I was coming down to the spring to check my water line and I saw your lantern go out." "Your cabin," Mary repeated. "You live on this mountain permanently." "Going on 7 years," he said. "Alone." He paused briefly and she noticed the pause, and then he said, "Yes." They walked in silence for a few minutes after that, and Mary focused on placing her boots exactly where his had been, and tried not to think about how close she had been to the 6-foot drop he had mentioned, or about the wolves, whose howling had gone quiet since he appeared. She wondered if they knew he was there and had simply decided the odds were not in their favor. The trail widened and then opened abruptly onto the main path that she recognized from her afternoon walk, and the lights of Elkhorn Crossing became visible far below, scattered and warm against the darkness of the valley floor. She felt relief move through her body in a long, slow wave. "There it is," Caleb said, and stopped. He held the lantern out to her. "Take this. The trail from here is clear enough, but it will help." "But you need it to get back to your cabin," Mary said, not reaching for it immediately. "I know this mountain well enough to walk it blind," he said, and from the matter-of-fact way he said it, she understood he was not exaggerating. He held the lantern out a little further and she took it, and their fingers did not quite touch but were close enough that she was aware of his warmth even through the cold. "Thank you," she said, looking up at him. "You may have saved my life, Mr. Holloway. I want you to know I understand that." He looked at her for a moment, and even in the insufficient light of the lantern she held, she could see something move behind his eyes, some reaction he was keeping quiet and internal, as was apparently his habit. "Don't come up the northern trail after sundown again," he said. "I will endeavor not to need rescuing," Mary said, with a dignity that she felt was entirely warranted. This time the corner of his mouth did move, definitely and unmistakably, though it was still modest as smiles went. "Good night, Miss Quinn." "Good night, Mr. Holloway." She walked down the trail to Elkhorn Crossing with the lantern burning steadily in her hand, and she did not look back, but she was quite certain he stood there on the ridge and watched until she was safely at the bottom. Mrs. Carmichael was waiting up for her, which Mary had expected, and there was a level of scolding that Mary felt she probably deserved, and a cup of strong tea that she definitely deserved, and eventually she was in her bed with her heart still beating faster than it strictly needed to. She lay in the dark of Mrs. Carmichael's spare room and thought about dark eyes that caught lantern light and held it, and about the particular quality of a voice that spoke as if it had nothing to prove, and about a man who had handed her safety at the end of his arm's reach, and then retreated back into the mountain without asking for anything in return. She thought about him for quite a long time before she finally slept. The next morning, she stood in front of her class and taught grammar and arithmetic and a reading exercise from the McGuffey Reader. And she did it well, because she loved the work and the children, but some portion of her mind kept returning to Caleb Holloway like a compass needle that has been temporarily displaced and is working its way back to north. She asked about him that evening at supper, casually, The way she had learned to ask about things in a new town when she did not want to make too much of her interest. Mrs. Carmichael, who was 61 years old and had opinions about everything and was willing to share them all, set down her fork and looked at Mary with the particular expression of a woman who has waited her whole life to be asked exactly this question. "Caleb Holloway," Mrs. Carmichael said, as if savoring the name. "Now there is a story." The story, as Mrs. Carmichael told it, was this. Caleb Holloway had come to Colorado Territory from Tennessee, where he had grown up in the mountains and learned hunting and trapping from his father before the war. He had fought for the Union, which in Tennessee meant fighting against most of his neighbors, and had come back from the war a man who preferred the silence of wilderness to the company of those who had become strangers to him. He had come west, had spent some years as a scout, and then as a trapper, and had eventually settled on the slope above Elkhorn Crossing because the hunting was good and the altitude kept most people from bothering him. "He comes down to town maybe once a month," Mrs. Carmichael said. "Trades his furs at the store, picks up his supplies, says maybe 14 words to people while he is here and goes back up. He is not unfriendly, mind you. He helped pull 3 men out of a collapsed mine shaft 2 winters ago, stayed 2 days to help shore up the tunnel. He just does not need people the way people generally need each other. Is he," Mary searched for the right word, "is he content up there alone?" Mrs. Carmichael looked at her with kind eyes. "That, my dear, is the question that nobody has ever managed to ask him directly. 3 days passed, then 5, then a week." Mary taught her classes and helped Thomas Beale, who had recovered and returned to school with color in his cheeks, catch up on the lessons he had missed. She ate breakfast and supper with Mrs. Carmichael and helped her with the kitchen garden in the afternoons when the light was good. She attended Sunday service at the church, which was conducted by a minister named Reverend Hayes, who had a booming voice and a genuine warmth that made the hard wooden pews almost comfortable. She established herself in the rhythms of Elkhorn Crossing, and those rhythms were not unpleasant, but she kept looking up at the mountain. On a Wednesday, 2 weeks after the night of the dead lantern, Caleb Holloway came down to town. She saw him from the schoolhouse window, crossing the main street in the late afternoon with a bundle of furs slung over one shoulder, moving with the easy, ground-covering stride of a man for whom every surface is the same, pavement or rock or forest floor. He was bigger than she had understood in the dark, broader and taller, and in the flat afternoon light of the mountain town she could see him clearly for the first time. His dark hair touched his collar, slightly longer than most men in town wore theirs. His jaw was clean-shaved, which surprised her somehow. He wore a canvas shirt that fit tightly across shoulders that were built like something architectural, and his arms, bare to the elbow where he had rolled his sleeves in the mild afternoon, were corded with muscle in a way that spoke not of vanity but of continuous, serious use. She was staring. She knew she was staring, and she made herself look back at the arithmetic problem on the slate board with a composure she did not entirely feel. After the children left at 3 o'clock, she told herself she was going to the general store because she needed writing paper for the class, which was true. She told herself this had nothing to do with the fact that the general store was where a man who traded furs would inevitably end up. This was less convincingly true, and she knew it, but she went anyway, because Mary Quinn had never in her life pretended to herself that she was something other than what she was. He was at the counter when she entered, concluding his business with the store's owner, a broad-faced man named Horace Webb, who was counting coins into Caleb's palm. Caleb was listening to something Horace was telling him about a dispute over a mining claim, and he was listening the way he apparently did everything, with complete, unhurried attention, without interruption, as if he had all the time in the world and the speaker had earned the full use of it. He looked up when the bell above the door sounded, and his eyes found her immediately, and something shifted in his expression that he controlled very quickly but not quite quickly enough for a person who was paying close attention. "Miss Quinn," he said. "Mr. Holloway," she said, "I am glad I have the opportunity to thank you properly in daylight. I did not feel I expressed it adequately the other night." "You expressed it fine," he said. He pocketed the coins Horace had counted, and Horace looked between them with the bright, alert eyes of a man who has lived in a small town long enough to recognize the beginnings of something interesting. "I would like to offer you supper," Mary said. "Mrs. Carmichael would not mind, and she is an excellent cook. It seems the least I can offer the man who kept me from walking off a cliff." She had not planned to say that. She had planned something more measured and appropriate. But the words were out, and she looked at him directly, because there was no graceful retreat from a direct offer, and she was not a woman who retreated from things she meant. Caleb Holloway looked at her for a long, slow moment in which Horace Webb held very still behind the counter, apparently afraid to break whatever was happening in his store. Then Caleb said, "That is a kind offer. Is that a yes?" Another pause. "Yes," he said, and something in his voice had gone a fraction softer, almost imperceptibly, but Mary was paying close attention. Supper at Mrs. Carmichael's was one of the more extraordinary evenings of Mary's recent life, and not because anything dramatic occurred. Caleb sat at the table with his hat in his lap, and ate Mrs. Carmichael's pot roast with the focused appreciation of a man who cooked for himself in a mountain cabin, and knew what a properly seasoned meal meant. Mrs. Carmichael, to her lasting credit, did not interrogate him, but instead talked cheerfully about the town and asked him questions about mountain wildlife that she actually wanted answered. And Caleb answered them in his quiet, precise way, and slowly, over the course of the meal, the slight guardedness that sat around him like a second coat began to ease. Mary watched this process with fascination. She watched the way he relaxed in degrees, like ice melting slowly, revealing the person underneath, who was thoughtful and precise and occasionally, briefly, funny in a dry way that made her laugh before she had fully decided to. She watched his hands around the coffee cup, large hands, weathered and scarred in small ways from years of outdoor work, and she thought they were the most honest-looking hands she had ever seen. He stayed 2 hours, which Mrs. Carmichael later told her was approximately twice as long as Caleb Holloway had ever spent inside any building in Elkhorn Crossing that was not a mine shaft. When he left, he stood at the door and looked at Mary in the lamplight of the front hall and said, "Thank you for the meal, Miss Quinn." "Thank you for walking me down a mountain," she said. He put his hat on. He looked at her for one more moment, and she had the feeling again of something deep and still and not yet fully visible, the way she'd felt standing at the edge of the mountain in the dark, aware of something large in the space that her lantern didn't reach. Then he was out the door and down the steps and moving up the street toward the mountain trail, and Mary stood in the doorway and watched him go, and did not pretend to herself that she wasn't doing exactly that. Over the following weeks, something shifted in the pattern of Caleb Holloway's monthly visits to Elkhorn Crossing, where once he had come on no particular schedule and for purely practical reasons, he now seemed to appear with a frequency that defied the explanation of fur trading alone. Mary noticed this the way she noticed most things, completely and without mentioning it out loud, until she had organized her observations into something coherent. He came down on a Friday and repaired the loose step on the school building's front porch, which he had apparently noticed on his last visit, and had simply, without announcement or permission, decided to fix. Mary discovered this when she arrived Monday morning to find the step solid beneath her foot where it had been treacherous for weeks. She asked Horace Webb if he knew who had done it, and Horace scratched his chin and said that, well, now that she mentioned it, he had seen Caleb Holloway near the school building Friday afternoon. She found him at the edge of town 2 Saturdays later, leaning against the fence post outside the church and talking to Reverend Hayes, and he straightened when he saw her approaching and touched the brim of his hat, and she felt the gesture like a warm hand pressed briefly against her chest. She started making reasons to be outside when he came to town. He started making reasons to come to town more often, November arrived with a cold snap that frosted the windows of Mrs. Carmichael's house overnight and sent everyone reaching for their heavier coats. The mountains above Elkhorn Crossing went white at the peaks, and the mornings had a crystalline quality that Mary found beautiful in a way she had never experienced in Cincinnati, where winter was gray and damp rather than sharp and brilliant. She stood at her classroom window sometimes and looked at the mountain and thought about a man living alone up there in the white silence, and felt something she could not quite name, an ache that was not quite longing and not quite worry but held elements of both. On a Sunday afternoon in the second week of November, she was walking along the creek that ran behind the eastern edge of town, following its bank through a grove of cottonwoods that had lost most of their leaves, when she heard footsteps on the frozen ground behind her and turned to find Caleb Holloway about 20 feet back, moving in his usual unhurried way. "I did not hear you come up behind me," she said. "I know," he said. "You were thinking hard about something. How could you tell? You walk differently when you are thinking," he said, and then looked as though he had said more than he intended and was deciding how to manage the consequence. Mary felt warmth bloom in her chest. "You have been watching me walk," she said. "It is a small town," Caleb said, with a neutrality that was absolutely not convincing. "Difficult not to notice things." She laughed, and the sound of it surprised her, genuine and clear in the cold air. "Would you like to walk with me, Mr. Holloway? Or are you going to continue following 20 feet behind?" He came forward and fell into step beside her, and they walked along the creek together, and the silence between them was entirely different from every other silence she had experienced with other people. It was not empty but full of things that were being said without words, and Mary found she did not feel the need to fill it. This itself was unusual. She generally felt the need to fill silences. "What were you thinking about?" he asked, after a while. "You," she said, because she had decided at some point in the preceding weeks that she was not going to be dishonest with this man, even about the things that made her feel exposed. "I was thinking about you living alone up there in the winter." He was quiet for several steps. The creek moved beside them, dark and quick between its ice-edged banks. "It is not as hard as people imagine," he said finally. "I did not say it was hard," Mary said. "I said I was thinking about it." He looked at her sideways, and she looked back at him, and neither of them looked away for a moment longer than was strictly comfortable. And when Caleb Holloway finally turned his eyes back to the creek path, there was a quality to the set of his jaw that suggested a man who was contending with something significant. They walked another quarter-mile before he spoke again. "I have been thinking about you too," he said, and his voice was the same as always, low and steady, but she heard something in it that had not been there before, a thread of something that cost him effort to say. "Since the night I found you on the mountain, I have not been able to stop." Mary stopped walking. He stopped beside her and looked at her, and in the thin November sunlight filtering through the bare cottonwoods she could see him plainly, the strong lines of his face, the dark eyes that held things deep down that most people would never bother to look for, the width of his shoulders, and the way he held himself when he was uncertain, not smaller, but more careful, as if he were moving through terrain he had not mapped yet and was treating every step with respect. "I am glad," she said softly. "I am not an easy man," he said. "I know that about myself. I have been alone a long time, and I am set in ways that would frustrate most people." "You are warning me," she said. "I am being honest with you." "I appreciate the honesty," Mary said. "Let me be honest in return. I came to this town because my life in Cincinnati had run out of paths forward. I did not come looking for anything other than work and a new start. But I have found, since arriving here, that I am looking at this mountain quite a lot and thinking about the man who lives on it." The silence that followed was entirely different from the comfortable silences they had been sharing. This one had weight and direction like a current. "Miss Quinn," Caleb said. "Mary," she said, "I think, given the conversation we are currently having, you might use my given name." "Mary," he said, and she heard what the name did in his voice when he said it, felt it like the first time a fire catches in a cold room. He reached out and took her hand, which was bare because she had been holding her gloves, and his hand was warm even in the cold air, and large, and she felt immediately the steadiness of him, the same steadiness she had felt that night on the mountain when he had caught her arm in the dark. "I would like to court you properly," he said, "if you are willing." "I am very willing," she said. He looked down at their joined hands, and then back up at her, and the smile that moved across his face was full this time, complete, the kind of smile that a face makes when it has not done this in a very long time and has missed it. It changed him entirely. It made him beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with the conventional markers of beauty and everything to do with the rare, startling quality of a guarded thing becoming open. Mary Quinn stood there in the November cold by the creek in Elkhorn Crossing, Colorado Territory, and felt absolutely certain that she had been exactly right to come west. Courting, in the practical sense of 1873 Colorado Territory, looked different from the courtships described in the novels Mary had read in Ohio. There were no calling cards or parlor visits, no formal dances or garden parties. What there was instead was this. Caleb came down from the mountain on Wednesdays and Saturdays without fail through the rest of November, and he and Mary walked together in the afternoons, and sometimes they sat in Mrs. Carmichael's kitchen and talked over coffee, while that good woman made herself busy in other parts of the house. And sometimes he came to the schoolhouse after the children left and helped her organize books or mend the broken spine of the globe that sat on her desk. And they talked while they worked with the ease of two people who have discovered in each other a mind that fits comfortably against their own. She learned him in pieces, the way you learn a landscape, not all at once but through repeated visits that reveal new things. She learned that he had a memory that was almost uncomfortable in its precision, that he could describe a trail he had walked once 7 years ago in perfect detail. She learned that he had read extensively despite the remoteness of his life, trading books at the store in Elkhorn, crossing the way other men traded equipment, and that his tastes ran to history and natural science and the occasional novel. She learned that the war had left marks in him that he did not discuss directly, but that she could sometimes see in the way he went very still at loud sudden noises, and that she did not press him on, because she trusted that he would tell her what he could when he could. She learned that he was funny, quietly and precisely funny, in a way that surfaced unexpectedly and made her laugh in sudden bursts that she usually had to muffle with her hand. She learned that when he listened to her, he listened with his entire self, without his attention drifting or his eyes moving past her shoulder to something more interesting elsewhere, and that this quality, which she had always considered simply basic courtesy, was in practice extraordinarily rare. He learned her too. She could see it happening, the way he began to anticipate the direction of her thoughts, the way he sometimes completed a sentence she had started and got it exactly right. He learned that she had strong opinions about education and was not shy about expressing them. He learned that she could be stubborn to the point of irrationality when she believed she was right about something, and that she was usually right, and that the combination of these facts made arguing with her both futile and entertaining. He learned that she had been lonely in Cincinnati in ways she had not fully acknowledged to herself until she arrived somewhere she was not lonely, and that this discovery, being known by someone, being fully seen by someone, was new and enormous for her. He came to her one Wednesday in late November carrying a book he had brought down from his cabin, a heavy volume on the geological formations of the Rocky Mountains, because she had mentioned once, casually, that she wished she had better resources for teaching the children about the landscape they lived in. He had remembered, and he had carried a heavy book 2 miles down a mountain in the cold because she had mentioned it once. Mary held the book in her hands and looked up at him and felt something so large and warm move through her that she had to breathe carefully to keep her composure. "You walked it down here for me," she said. "It was not a burden," he said, and the simplicity of it, the way he said it as if the answer were obvious, undid something in her entirely. They were standing in the school building, the afternoon light going golden through the western windows, the slates all cleaned and the desks all in rows, the fire in the small iron stove keeping the room warm enough. And Mary Quinn set the heavy book down on the nearest desk and stood up on her toes and kissed Caleb Holloway once, softly, on the corner of his jaw, which was as far as she could conveniently reach without assistance. He went very still. Then one of his large hands came up and cupped the side of her face with a gentleness that was startling from those hands, a gentleness that felt deliberate and considered, as if he were handling something of great value that he did not want to damage. He tilted her face up toward his, and he kissed her properly, slow and certain and thorough, and Mary had been kissed before, twice, by two men who had meant nothing in particular, and this was entirely unlike those experiences in every conceivable way. When they separated, she was warm all the way through despite the November air, and he was looking at her with those dark eyes that held deep water, and his hand was still against her cheek, and he was breathing a little faster than usual. "Mary," he said, and the way he said her name was the same as the fire catching. "Yes," she said, somewhat breathlessly. "I want you to come see my cabin," he said. "In daylight, when it is safe. I want you to see where I live." "I would like that very much," she said. She came up to his cabin on a clear Saturday in early December, riding behind him on his horse since the trail was too rough for a lady's walking shoes in the cold, and he had made this point in a tone that brooked no argument. She wrapped her arms around his waist to hold on and felt the solidity of him, the breadth of his back, the warmth radiating through his coat, and thought that there were worse things in the world than holding onto Caleb Holloway on a mountain trail. The cabin was not what she had expected, though she could not precisely have said what she had expected. It was small but extremely solid, built from logs that had been fitted with an attention to craft that went beyond mere practicality. Inside, it was organized with the particular precision of a person who has learned that disorder in a remote location has real consequences. The shelves were built into the walls and stacked with supplies and books and tools, everything with a logical place and in it. There was a large stone fireplace that heated the space efficiently, and a table and two chairs, and the chairs made her pause, because a man living alone has no need of two chairs, and she wondered when he had made or acquired the second one, and whether he had been hoping for something or simply preparing for it. He showed her everything, and in doing so he was showing her himself, because a man's home is his interior life made physical, and what she saw was a person of deep order and quiet capability, someone who found meaning in doing things correctly, in fitting things well, in maintaining what he built. She ran her hand along the shelf of books and read the spines and felt her admiration for him expand into new territory. "You made all of this yourself," she said. "The furniture, the shelves." "Over time," he said. "It is beautiful," she said, and meant it entirely. He stood in the middle of his small, precise, well-built cabin and looked at her standing there in it, and something in his face shifted in a way she recognized now, that shift toward open, toward unguarded. "I have been up here 7 years," he said quietly. "I thought I was content." "And now?" she asked. "Now," he said, "I am aware of the difference between content and happy." Mary crossed the floor of the cabin and took both his hands in hers and looked up at him. "I am happy," she said. "I want you to know that. Whatever this becomes, I am already happier than I have been in years." He pulled her close, and she went willingly, and he held her against his chest in the warmth of the cabin with the mountain cold just outside the walls, and she could hear his heart beating, steady and strong, like everything else about him. December settled over Elkhorn Crossing in earnest, and the mountain went deeply white, and the days shortened to brief, brilliant windows of cold light between long darknesses. The school continued through December, and Mary had the children working on a small performance for the town's Christmas celebration, which Reverend Hayes had organized at the church. Life in the town took on the particular quality of winter. People drew closer together against the cold, sharing resources and company and heat, and Mary found herself woven into the fabric of Elkhorn Crossing, in a way she had not anticipated when she had arrived with her 2 trunks and her letter of employment. She talked to Caleb about it one Wednesday, walking through the town along the main street while the light was still good, their breath making small clouds in the cold air. "I feel like I belong here," she said with some wonder. "I did not feel that way in Cincinnati, not truly. I was always just renting a piece of a place that was not quite mine." Caleb walked beside her and listened with his full attention the way he always did. "Some people fit in cities," he said. "Some people need to be somewhere they can see to the edge of things." "You fit in cities?" she asked, knowing the answer but wanting to hear him say it. "Not even slightly," he said. "No," she agreed. "You would be wrong in a city the way a mountain would be wrong on a flat plain. You belong here." He looked at her, and the look was complicated and tender. "And you," he said, "do you belong here?" She thought about the mountain in the early morning from Mrs. Carmichael's window, turning pink with the dawn. She thought about her students' faces bent over their slates. She thought about the particular quality of the air at this altitude, sharp and clean in a way that made every breath feel like a deliberate act. She thought about the man walking beside her. "Yes," she said, "I believe I do." On Christmas Eve, the town gathered at the church for the celebration, and Mary's students performed their small program, which they did with tremendous earnestness and some imperfect recall of the words and absolute commitment that made every parent in the room love them fiercely. Mary sat in the front row and watched them with a fullness in her chest that she recognized as the particular joy of watching something you built from nothing succeed. Caleb was in the back row. He had come down from the mountain specifically for the celebration, which was not something he had been known to do in previous years, a fact that Mrs. Carmichael shared with Mary in a whisper that was not entirely discreet. He stayed for the singing afterward, and for the cider and the gingerbread that people had brought to share, and he stood near the back wall in his clean canvas shirt with his hat in his hands, slightly removed from the general warmth and noise, but not absent from it, present in his own contained way. Mary found him after the children had been collected by their parents and the room had begun to thin. She brought him a cup of cider, and he accepted it with a nod of thanks, and they stood together by the back wall of the church with the candlelight warm around them and the sound of the remaining townsfolk talking cheerfully at the other end of the room. "They did well," he said, nodding toward where the last of the children were pulling on their coats near the door. "They did beautifully," Mary said. "Thomas Beale remembered every single word of his poem. He practiced it on me 6 times. Caleb smiled, not the small contained version, but the full one that changed his face, and she felt that same warmth in her chest that she always felt when she saw it, because it was something he gave to very few people and she knew it. "I have something for you," he said. He reached into his coat and brought out a small object wrapped in cloth and held it toward her. She unwrapped it carefully and found inside a small carved wooden brooch, oval, with a mountain landscape worked into it in remarkable detail, fine lines of trees climbing toward a peaked summit, a moon over the top. The carving was extraordinarily precise. "You made this," she said. "Long winter evenings," he said, as if this were a modest thing and not an act of sustained attention and care. "It is elk bone, not wood. It holds the detail better." She looked up at him and did not trust herself to say what she was feeling without saying all of it, and she did not want to say all of it here in the back of a church with half the town still present. So she said, "It is the most beautiful thing anyone has ever made for me." And he looked at her as if she were something he had been waiting for without knowing he was waiting. January came in hard and clear and bitterly cold, and then February came and was harder still. Caleb and Mary settled into a pattern that had the quality of something established and enduring. He came to town twice a week when the weather allowed, and once a week when it did not, and each visit added more to what was being built between them, layer upon layer, conversation and shared silence and touch, and the steady accumulation of knowing each other deeply. He told her about the war in January, on a Wednesday evening in Mrs. Carmichael's kitchen, while the wind howled outside and the fire in the stove made the room a warm island against the cold. He told it carefully and without drama in his precise, quiet way, but she heard the weight beneath the precision, and she did not look away from it or minimize it. She received it as it was given, which was as something that had cost him to speak. She told him about her father, who had left when she was 7 years old and gone to California and never come back, and about the particular shape that absence had left in her, the way she had spent years being very capable and very self-sufficient, and not allowing herself to need things that could disappear. She told him this in return for what he had given her, and when she was done, he took her hand across the table and held it without saying anything, because some things are best answered with presence rather than words, and he understood this better than anyone she had ever met. In February, Gerald Ashworth came to Mary with a proposal that was not what she was expecting. He had been contacted by an educational board in Denver that was looking to fill a position there, a larger school, better resources, improved salary. He thought she ought to know about it. He presented it with the careful neutrality of a man who is trying to do the right thing without revealing what he wants the outcome to be. Mary thanked him and said she would think about it. That night, alone in her room at Mrs. Carmichael's, she sat with the implications of it. Denver was larger, more established, with the kind of opportunities for a woman of her education and abilities that Elkhorn Crossing, for all its virtues, could not offer. The salary was better. The resources were better. The professional future was better on paper in every way she could measure. She pulled out the elk bone brooch and turned it over in her fingers in the lamplight, feeling the carved peaks against her thumb. She already knew what she was going to do. She had known from the moment Ashworth spoke Denver's name. But she sat with the question honestly anyway, because she believed in honesty with herself, and she wanted to be sure she was choosing what she was choosing and not simply drifting. She was choosing Elkhorn Crossing. She was choosing the mountain and the children who were learning to read in her schoolhouse and Mrs. Carmichael's kitchen, and the particular quality of the air at altitude. She was choosing Caleb Holloway with his dark eyes and his quiet voice and his hands that could build a cabin and also carve something delicate and precise from bone. She was choosing the life she had found rather than the life that had been theoretically available. She told Ashworth the next morning that she appreciated the information, but that she was content in Elkhorn Crossing and intended to stay. She told Caleb that Wednesday. She told him matter-of-factly, without drama, the way she told him most things, because she had found that with him, plainness of speech was always better received than performance. He was very still for a moment after she told him. Then he said, "You are sure?" "I have been sure since I saw the mountain from the stage when I arrived," she said. "I simply required 3 months to understand what I was certain of." He stood up from the chair at Mrs. Carmichael's kitchen table and came around to where she was sitting, and he sat on the edge of the table beside her, which brought him down to something closer to her level, and he took her face in both his large, careful hands and looked at her with an intensity that she felt all the way through. "I want to ask you something," he said. "Ask me," she said. "I know I live on a mountain. I know the life there is not easy. I know I am not the simplest man to—" "Caleb," she said. "Mary, ask me." He took a breath. "Will you marry me?" Mary Quinn looked at the man who had found her in the dark on a mountain with a dying lantern and walked her straight to safety, who had fixed her school's broken step without being asked, who had carried a heavy book 2 miles in the cold because she had mentioned it once, who had made her something beautiful from bone on long winter evenings, who had listened to her with his whole self and given her his whole self in return, and she said, "Yes, absolutely yes." He kissed her, and this kiss was different from the others. It had resolution in it, completion, the quality of a thing that has arrived at its destination. They were married in April, when the world was beginning to turn green again, in Reverend Hayes's church with the whole of Elkhorn Crossing in attendance, because the whole of Elkhorn Crossing had been watching this unfold since November and felt invested in the outcome. Mrs. Carmichael cried happily in the front row. Thomas Beale, who was sitting with his father Frank in the third row, watched the proceedings with a solemn attention that suggested he understood he was witnessing something significant. Mary wore a dress she had ordered from Denver, pale blue wool with ivory buttons, and she wore the elk-bone brooch at her collar. Caleb wore his best shirt and a new coat he had made himself over the winter, and he stood at the front of the church and watched her walk toward him with an expression on his face that Mary would later describe to Mrs. Carmichael as the expression of a man who has been given back something he thought was lost. After the ceremony, the town laid out a celebration in the church hall with food that people had brought from their own kitchens and music from the fiddle player who worked at the saloon and was a better musician than his daytime occupation suggested. Mary danced 3 times with her husband, which was as many times as Caleb Holloway would consent to dance, and each time was better than the last as he relaxed into the joy of the occasion and let the stiffness fall away. They spent their first weeks of married life in his cabin on the mountain, which he had spent the preceding 2 months preparing for her, not just adding to it but reconsidering it, adding a second window for light, building a proper storage room off the back for her trunks, constructing a desk where she could work on lesson plans in the evenings by the fire. He had done all of this quietly and without making any ceremony of it, and when she saw it for the first time on their wedding night, she stood in the middle of the reordered cabin and felt her eyes fill. "You thought of everything," she said. "I tried to," he said, with the slight roughness in his voice that she had come to recognize as the sound of him feeling something large. Life on the mountain was hard in the ways he had warned her and more rewarding than she had imagined. Mary continued to teach at the school in Elkhorn Crossing, riding down with Caleb on school days, and on the days when the weather made the trail difficult, she stayed with Mrs. Carmichael, who had kept the room and charged them nothing for it, which was Mrs. Carmichael's characteristically generous way of refusing to be thanked. The arrangement worked with the particular pragmatic efficiency of frontier life, where sentimentality had to coexist with the actual conditions of survival. She learned the mountain from Caleb through the spring and summer, learned its trails and its dangers and its astonishments. He was a patient teacher, as patient with her as she was with her students, and she had the curious experience of being a student again after years of being only a teacher, and found she liked it, liked the particulars of what he knew, the ways to read weather in cloud formations and wind direction, the tracks of different animals in the soft spring mud, the names of plants and what they were good for. She found herself returning to the schoolhouse with new material, because learning one thing well always leads to the discovery of 10 more things worth learning. Spring bloomed across the mountain and the valley below in a way that was new to her, more sudden and explosive than Ohio Springs, as if the season arrived running rather than walking, desperate to make up for the length of winter. The wildflowers came up through the thinning snow in colors so bright they looked almost improbable, and Mary walked the trails near the cabin in the afternoons after school and thought about her life in Cincinnati, that careful, compressed, insufficient life, and felt something like awe at the distance between that version of herself and the woman she was now. One evening in late May, she and Caleb sat on the low, flat rock outside the cabin door that served as a kind of porch, watching the light change on the mountains to the west as the sun went down behind them. The sky went through its full repertoire from gold to orange to a deep bruised purple that darkened incrementally to the first appearance of stars. Mary had her knees pulled up to her chest and her head resting against Caleb's shoulder, and his arm was around her, and the silence between them was full to the point of abundance. "I think about that night," she said. "The night I got lost. I think about it often." "So do I," he said. "It seems like something that was supposed to happen," she said. "I know that is a very unscientific way to think about it." "Maybe," he said. "But I have spent 7 years on this mountain, and I have never been on that particular slope at that particular time on an October night before. I always check my water line in the morning." She lifted her head from his shoulder and looked at him. "What made you go at night that time?" He looked back at her, and in the last light of the sunset she could see the depth of him, clear and open now in a way it had not been when she first met him, the way a pool looks different when the surface is still and the water is clean. "I heard your lantern go out," he said. "The wind brings sound down the slope. I heard it gutter and then stop, and I knew somebody was up there in the dark, and I went." He said it simply, the way he said all things, without embellishment or drama. He had heard a lantern go out and he had gone to it. She thought about the 7 years of solitude and the man who emerged from them to walk toward a stranger's failing light, and the improbable chain of events that had made this evening possible, the two of them sitting on a rock in the Colorado mountain dark with the stars coming out above them. "I am very glad you went," she said. He pressed his lips to her temple, warm and certain. "So am I." Summer on the mountain and in the valley was full and good. Mary's second year of teaching began in September, and she had a full classroom of 22 students now, because several mining families had arrived in the spring, and the children had been added to her roster, and she approached the larger number with the energy of someone who considers abundance a good problem to have. She started a small library in the corner of the classroom, soliciting books from families and from Horace Webb at the general store, and writing letters to organizations in Denver that she had read about in the newspapers, organizations dedicated to frontier education that sometimes donated materials. She was not shy about asking for things she believed in. Caleb watched this aspect of her with undisguised admiration. He told her once, in his direct way, that she was the most determined person he had ever encountered, and she had laughed and said that was only because he had spent too many years talking mainly to mountains, which had no opinion on the matter. He had given her the full smile for that. In October, 1 year exactly from the night she had lost herself on the mountain, Mary discovered that she was expecting their first child. She told him on a Thursday evening at the cabin, sitting across the supper table from him with her hands folded on the surface the way she folded them when she was working up to something she wanted to say carefully. He watched her build to it with the patient attention he brought to everything she did, and when she finally said it, something happened in his face that she had not seen there before, something vast and unguarded that lasted for several seconds before he could collect himself. And even then it was not fully collected. It was simply quieter. He came around the table with the same directness he brought to everything, and he put his arms around her and held her with tremendous care, more careful than usual, as if she had become suddenly fragile, which she was fairly certain she had not, but she did not correct him because the tenderness of it was extraordinary. "Are you well?" he asked against her hair. "I am entirely well," she said. "I have felt a little unsteady in the mornings, but otherwise I am healthy and strong." "We should speak to Dr. Marsh," he said. "I intend to," she said, "on Friday." "I am coming with you," he said. He said it in the tone that meant it was not a negotiation, and she did not make it one, because she understood the difference between his stubbornness on her behalf and his stubbornness out of general habit, and this was clearly the first kind, and she had decided early in their marriage that she would pick her battles on the second kind and let the first kind be. Dr. Marsh confirmed what Mary already knew, and told her she was in excellent health for a woman at this altitude, which he said with the particular pride of a doctor who considered his mountain community a specimen of hardy living. He gave her instructions that were sensible and achievable, and Caleb listened to every word with the focused, retentive attention that Mary had learned meant he was logging it all permanently in that precise memory of his. On the walk back from the doctor's surgery, Caleb was quiet in a way that was slightly different from his usual quiet. She took his arm and walked beside him and waited. "I am going to build a room onto the cabin," he said finally, "before the heavy snow comes." "We have until late spring," she pointed out. "I would rather build it in fall when the wood is still manageable," he said, "and I want to enlarge the main room as well." "The cabin is the right size for 2 people, but for 3, "Caleb," she said, and squeezed his arm. "What?" "You are going to be wonderful," she said. He looked at her, and the look had the same quality it had worn on their wedding day, the expression of a man who has been given back something he thought was lost. "I just want everything to be right for you," he said quietly. "For both of you." "It is already right," she said. "It is more right than anything I have ever had." He built the addition to the cabin in October, working every day he could spare from trapping and hunting, with a focused intensity that Mary watched from the schoolhouse door when she was home, and from reports by the various residents of Elkhorn Crossing who passed by the mountain trail and observed him at work. He was, by every account, approaching this project with the same methodical, thorough commitment he brought to everything. And by the end of October, there was a new room off the back of the cabin, soundly built and warmly insulated, waiting for its purpose. Winter arrived as it always did, abruptly and without apology, and the mountain went white, and the trails became harder, and Mary began spending more nights at Mrs. Carmichael's as her pregnancy advanced, because the trail up to the cabin in deep snow was genuinely difficult, and Caleb would not hear of her navigating it in her condition, which was the second kind of his stubbornness. But she accepted it because she privately thought he was probably right, and she was not too proud to admit it. He came down to her every day, without exception, in conditions that would have kept most men in their cabins. She saw him come through the snow with his hat pulled low and his coat white with frost, and felt the particular fierceness of loving someone who will walk through any weather to be where you are. Mrs. Carmichael, for her part, was entirely delighted by all of this and made no attempt to conceal it. She fed Caleb enormous suppers every evening he arrived, and she made Mary drink warm broth every morning, and she sat with Mary in the evenings knitting small garments in a competent, practical way and talking about everything and nothing. And Mary felt the gift of her company deeply, this surrogate grandmother the town had provided her. February brought the hardest cold of the year, and then March brought the first hints of relenting. And in the third week of March, in Mrs. Carmichael's house in Elkhorn Crossing with Dr. Marsh in attendance, and Caleb standing in the outer room in a state of contained intensity that was visible through the wall by sheer force of presence, Mary Quinn Holloway gave birth to a healthy boy with dark hair and lungs that announced themselves with impressive vigor. She heard Caleb exhale on the other side of the door when Dr. Marsh opened it and said it was done and everyone was well. A long, deep exhale of released tension that she heard clearly through the thin wall, and that made her smile even in her exhaustion. When he came in, he stood at the side of the bed and looked at her, and then at the wrapped bundle in her arms, and his face did the thing it did when something was too large to be contained. It went quiet and open and completely unguarded, and she had never loved him more in all the months they had been together than she did in that moment. "Come meet your son," she said. He sat on the edge of the bed, and she placed the baby in his arms and watched him receive the weight of the boy with the same focused, careful attention he brought to everything fragile and important. The baby looked comically small against the breadth of his chest. Caleb looked down at the dark-haired infant and said nothing for a long moment. "He looks like you," Mary said. "He is better looking than me," Caleb said with absolute sincerity, and Mary laughed, which made the baby startle and then settle. "What shall we name him?" she asked. They had discussed names in the evenings and had had the comfortable, slightly circular debates of two people who cannot fully agree but are not unhappy disagreeing. She had suggested Samuel, which Caleb liked but had no strong feeling for. He had suggested John, which she thought was too plain. They had gone back and forth on several others without resolution. Caleb looked at the baby in his arms for a long moment. "James," he said. "James Quinn Holloway, if you agree, after nobody in particular." "It just suits him." Mary looked at her son and said the name quietly and felt it settle. "James," she agreed. "Yes, James." They named him James Quinn Holloway, and he was 3 days old when Mary carried him up the mountain trail to the cabin, which she insisted on doing herself, and did with the steady confidence of a woman who had been walking this trail for nearly a year and a half and knew every root and rock of it. Caleb walked beside her with one hand ready, though he was careful not to hover excessively, because he had learned in 18 months of marriage the precise degree of hovering she would tolerate. The cabin was warm and expanded and waiting for them, and Mary stood in the main room and looked around at what Caleb had built, the solid walls and the shelves of books and the fire and the stone hearth and the new room opening off the back, and held her son against her shoulder, and felt a completeness she did not have words for. James Holloway grew through the spring and summer in the way that healthy mountain babies grow, sturdy and interested and loud in his opinions. He had his father's dark eyes and his mother's tendency toward strong positions on things, which Caleb observed with a mix of amusement and deep paternal pride that he expressed mostly through watching the boy with his particular quality of absolute attention. Mary returned to teaching in September when James was 6 months old, bringing him with her to the schoolhouse in the mornings when Caleb could not watch him, where he was received by the students with the enthusiasm of 22 children, encountering a very small person who was not yet capable of disagreeing with anything they said. Thomas Beale, now 12 and one of her most senior students, took an early proprietary interest in the baby's welfare that Mary found both touching and extremely useful, since Thomas could be relied upon to keep James from attempting to eat the chalk. The second year of their marriage was, if anything, more fully inhabited than the first. Mary had come to know the mountain in all 4 seasons now, and the mountain had become in her mind and heart what it was to Caleb, not just a landscape but a presence, something lived in relation to. She understood the rhythms of the trapping seasons and the hunting seasons, and the particular requirements of laying in enough supplies before the heaviest winter months. She understood the small but consequential community of Elkhorn Crossing, who needed what from whom, who was reliable and who was not, who the children came from and what their lives were like, and what they needed from her to become more than those lives might otherwise have allowed. She loved all of it. She loved it with the specific, grateful love of a person who has come into possession of exactly the right life and knows it. In November of their second year together, Caleb came in from a day of checking his trap lines with a quiet about him that was different from his usual quiet, the kind that meant he was working on something internally. She recognized this and waited for it, as she always waited for things from him, without pressure, because she had learned that pressing him produced silence but patience produced words. After supper, when James was asleep in the new room and the fire was burning low and comfortable, Caleb sat across from her at the table and said, "I want to tell you something." "Tell me," she said. He was quiet for a moment, the way he was quiet before careful speech. "Before you," he said, "I thought this was enough. The mountain and the quiet and the work. I had decided that was the shape of my life and I had made my peace with it. And now," she said softly. He looked at her, and what she saw in his face was something she had not seen in it in all the months she had known him, something completely unguarded and clear, as if every wall had come down at once. "Now I understand what I was making peace with," he said. "I was making peace with an absence I did not know how to name." Mary reached across the table and took his hand, and he turned it and held hers back. "I was lost on this mountain in the dark," she said, "and you walked me home. We have been walking home ever since." "Yes," he said, and smiled the full smile, and she felt it in her chest, warm and complete, the way she had felt the first time she saw it in November of the previous year and every time since. They sat by the fire in the mountain cabin with their son sleeping in the next room, and the Colorado night enormous and cold around them. And the warmth between them was something they had built together from nothing, a deliberate construction, careful and well-fitted like everything Caleb built, and it held the cold out entirely. James was 2 years old when Mary discovered she was expecting again, and Caleb took the news with the same profound, barely contained reaction as the first time, the exhale that was too long, the stillness that meant he was feeling something very large, and then the practical pivot to what needed to be done, what he needed to build and prepare, what he needed to make right. "Nothing needs to be built this time," she told him, laughing. "The cabin is already large enough." "I want to add a window to the main room," he said, with the slight defensiveness of a man who has been caught being practical about something emotional. "Then add a window," she said. "But it will not make the baby arrive any differently." He added the window. It made the main room considerably brighter in the mornings, which Mary had not specifically needed but found she loved. The way the early light came in across the table where she sat with her coffee and her lesson plans, long before the children or Caleb woke, in the particular stillness of a mountain morning that she had come to consider the most beautiful part of the day. Their daughter arrived in a June that was warm even at altitude, which Dr. Marsh said was favorable, and Mrs. Carmichael said was a sign of good character, which was not medical advice, but which Mary appreciated anyway. This birth was easier than the first, which the doctor attributed to Mary's general health and which Mary attributed to knowing what she was doing this time. The baby was pink and loud and had her mother's determined jaw, and Mary held her while Caleb stood over them both with his hand gentle on the baby's dark head. "Eleanor," Mary said. "I want to name her Eleanor." "Eleanor Holloway," Caleb said, testing it. He nodded. "It suits her." "Eleanor Me Holloway," Mary said. "Me was my mother's middle name." "Eleanor Me Holloway," he repeated, and the name settled between them like something set in place. James met his sister with the solemn gravity of a 2.5-year-old who has been extensively prepared for this event and is not entirely sure what to do with the result. He studied her for a long moment, then looked up at his father with his mother's directness and said, "She is very small." "She will grow," Caleb told him. James considered this. "Like I did. Exactly like you did." James appeared to find this acceptable. He asked to hold her, and Caleb sat with both children in the large chair by the fire, James tucked against his side and Eleanor in the curve of his arm, and Mary watched from the bed and felt something so complete and full that it had no adequate word, only the direct experience of it, warm and certain and permanent. The years in Elkhorn Crossing moved with the particular quality of time lived well, full and swift, and leaving good things behind like a river leaves good soil. James grew into a serious, curious boy with his father's patience and his mother's love of books, and could read at a level well above his age by the time he was 5, which his mother claimed no credit for, and everyone knew she had everything to do with. Eleanor grew into a child of fierce opinions and tremendous physical courage, who followed her father on short sections of trail as soon as she could walk steadily, and who had no fear of the mountain at all, regarding it as an extension of her own territory. Mary taught for 11 years at the school in Elkhorn Crossing and left it, when she finally did, because the town had grown large enough that the school board hired a second teacher and reorganized the structure, and Mary found herself in the position of having built something so well that it had outgrown her necessity to run it, which she considered the highest professional compliment. She did not stop teaching. She taught the children of the mountain families who were too remote for the school, riding out with Caleb when he checked his lines, and stopping at the scattered homesteads to leave materials and give instruction, which was irregular and imperfect, and deeply effective in the way that learning offered in the real context of people's lives often is. She wrote a long letter to the Denver Educational Board about the needs of remote frontier children, drawing on 11 years of specific, detailed observation, and the letter was read by people who mattered and contributed to a conversation that eventually produced better provision for frontier education in Colorado Territory, though the process took years, and Mary's name was not prominently attached to the outcome. She said, when Caleb expressed what she recognized as quiet frustration on her behalf at this, that the outcome was what mattered and not the credit, and she believed it, though she also believed that women in 1876 Colorado Territory were consistently not given credit for things they had built, and that this was wrong, and that it would be changed eventually by enough women refusing to accept it, and that she was one of those women whether or not this particular letter bore her name. Caleb listened to all of this, as he always listened to her, with his complete attention, and then said, "You are going to be a significant woman, Mary Holloway," in a tone that was not flattery but simple observation. "I have always been a significant woman," she said, with the precision of a person who has been underestimated enough times to have made peace with the fact and moved beyond needing to prove it to people who were not paying attention. "Yes," he said, and the simplicity of that yes was better than any elaborate agreement could have been. In the spring that James turned 10 and Alina turned 7, Caleb took both children up to the high ridge above the cabin on a clear May morning to show them the pass he had first scouted 20 years before. Mary went with them, walking the trail she knew now as well as her own kitchen, and when they reached the ridge and the full panorama of the mountains opened out before them in every direction, enormous and white-capped and endlessly layered, she stood with her hand in her husband's and watched her children stand at the edge of the view with their mouths open. "Papa," James said, in the voice of a boy who is seeing something too large for words but is reaching for them anyway, "how far does it go?" "As far as you can see and a great deal farther," Caleb said. Alina said nothing, which was unusual for Alina. She stood very still and looked at the mountains with an expression that Mary recognized, had worn it herself standing at the edge of things that were too beautiful to immediately resolve into something ordinary. After a while she turned and looked at her father and said, "I want to know all of it." "You have time," Caleb told her. "I want to start now," Alina said, with an entirely characteristic impatience. Mary laughed, and Caleb looked at her with a warmth in his eyes that was the same warmth she had seen there on the creek bank in November, on the wedding day, on the night James was born, in all the 10 years of mornings and evenings that had accumulated between them, the same warmth and something added to it, something that only years of shared life could produce, a depth and a steadiness that had grown from what began as attraction and become something far more durable. She thought, standing on that ridge with the Colorado sky enormous above her and her family around her, about a woman who had arrived in a mountain town with 2 trunks and a teaching certificate and a dead lantern, and a man who had heard that lantern go out in the dark and walked toward it without hesitation. She thought about the trail from that moment to this one, and how it had looked from inside it, one step at a time, each one taken carefully, the way Caleb had taught her to walk a mountain slope, testing the ground before committing your weight. And she thought that it was the best trail she had ever walked. "Come on then," she said to Alina, who was already pulling at her father's hand. "Show her the trail east. I will follow with James." Caleb looked back at her as Alina dragged him forward, and what she saw in that look was everything, 10 years of everything, and it was in his face freely and fully because he had long since stopped holding it in, had given it to her as completely as he gave her everything, without reservation or performance, with the direct and steady wholeheartedness of a man who had found something worth having and had never once taken it for granted. She watched him go ahead with their daughter, this large and gentle and capable man who had walked her out of darkness and into the best version of her life, and she stood on the ridge of the Colorado mountains in the warm May light with her son beside her, and she felt completely, thoroughly, permanently at home. Not the way Cincinnati had been home, by default and familiarity, but home the way a place you have chosen is home, the way a life you have built with your own hands and given your whole heart to is home. Home the way a mountain is home to the people who learn to read it, not by force or accommodation, but by love. "Are you coming, Mama?" James asked beside her, with his father's patience and his mother's curiosity and a future that stretched out before him as wide and bright as the view from the ridge. "Right behind you," she said, and took his hand and walked forward into it. The years that followed were good ones, marked by the ordinary and extraordinary in equal measure. Caleb eventually traded less in furs as the great trapper's era wound toward its close and transitioned to being one of the mountain guides that the increasingly confident town of Elkhorn Crossing employed to lead surveying parties and scientific expeditions into the high country, work that suited him perfectly and that paid better and left his hands less raw in the winter months. He was regarded by the expeditions he guided with a mixture of awe and absolute reliance, the way travelers always regard a person who knows the ground they are walking on far better than they do. Mary's work shifted, but never stopped. She sat on the newly formed school board when Elkhorn Crossing grew large enough to have one, and she was the only woman on it, and she was heard, partly because she was correct about most things and partly because she was Caleb Holloway's wife, and the town had a healthy respect for Caleb Holloway's opinions on people who did not listen to his wife appropriately. She wrote 3 more formal letters to educational bodies over the following years. The third one was published as an article in a Denver paper and attributed to her by name, which satisfied something she had been too principled to need, but too honest to pretend she did not want. James became, as his early seriousness suggested, a young man of considerable intellectual depth, who left Elkhorn Crossing at 17 to study in Denver and came back at 22 as a qualified engineer, because he had grown up watching his father build things well and could not imagine a more worthwhile occupation than building things well at scale. He brought back with him a quiet, sensible young woman he had met in Denver and married there, and Mary and Caleb welcomed her to the mountain and the cabin and the family with the same openness with which the mountain had, in its way, welcomed Mary 15 years before. Alina grew into exactly the fierce and curious woman her childhood had predicted, and she was the first daughter of any family in Elkhorn Crossing to formally pursue an education past the town school, which she did by writing letters that made no apologies for what she wanted, and were, as Caleb told Mary privately one evening, recognizably her daughter's letters. She became a nurse, which in the Colorado Territory of the 1880s was demanding and important work, and she did it with a combination of her mother's determination and her father's steady capability that served her patients well. In their 22nd year together, in a Colorado October that was bright and cold and exact in the way of October at altitude, Mary and Caleb sat outside the cabin on the low flat rock that had become their habitual evening place, with the mountains going gold and purple in the fading light, and James's son asleep inside in the room that had been James's own, because James and his family had come up for the autumn visit they made each year, and the cabin was full and warm and loud in the best way. Mary was 46 years old and Caleb was 53, and she looked at him in the October light, and he was different from the man she had first seen clearly in the general store, different in the way that time makes things different, the lines deeper, the hair at his temples carrying the first threads of silver, but his eyes were exactly the same, dark and deep and steady, and his hands were exactly the same, large and careful and warm. He had not lost any of the solidity of him. If anything, the years had made him more himself, the way good wood ages into its truest form. He was looking at her with the same assessment she could see it, reading the changes the years had made in her and finding them from his expression exactly to his liking. "What are you thinking?" she asked. "That I would like to walk down to the spring," he said, "the way we used to in the evenings. The children are inside. James is 28 years old," he said mildly. "I think he can manage." She laughed and stood, and he stood with her, and they walked together down the familiar trail in the last of the light, through the pines that she knew by heart, past the place where she had walked in the dark so many years ago with a dead lantern in her hands and no idea where she was going. And she thought about the extraordinary improbability of all of it. A single woman from Ohio and a solitary man from Tennessee meeting on a Colorado mountain because a lantern had run out of oil. They reached the spring, which still ran cold and clear from the rock, and stood beside it in the October dusk, and Caleb took her hand, the same large warm hand that had caught her arm in the dark all those years ago, and she looked up at him, and saw everything she had spent 22 years learning about this man, the depth and the steadiness and the fierce, particular love he had given her without reservation from the moment he decided to give it. "Do you remember," she said, What you said to me the night you found me. Don't come up the northern trail after sundown again, he said with the dry precision of perfect recall. She laughed. Before that, when I could not see anything and your lantern was the first light I had. He thought for a moment, and she saw the memory move through his face. I said, careful now. Ground drops about 6 feet, not 4 steps to your left. Yes, she said, and I thought, whoever this man is, he is going to be very important to me. Did you? He said, with the surprised sincerity of a man who has still not entirely accounted for the fact that he is someone who could be important to anyone. From the very first sentence, she confirmed. He turned toward her and took her face in his hands, the way he still did, with the same deliberate gentleness, and he kissed her in the October dusk by the spring on the mountain they both called home, and the mountain stood all around them in their enormous and indifferent way. And in the middle of all that wild and ancient space, the two of them were a small and warm and permanent thing. When they walked back up the trail to the cabin, the lights were on inside, and through the window she could see James sitting at the table with a book and his wife sitting across from him with their son on her knee, and the firelight made everything golden, and the door opened before they reached it, because Eleanor had come up unexpectedly from town, which she sometimes did, appearing without announcement the way she had appeared throughout her whole childhood, sudden and complete and entirely welcome. I thought you were coming next week, Mary said. I changed my mind, Eleanor said, with her father's calm and her mother's absoluteness. Is there supper left? There is always supper, Caleb said, and held the door. They all came in out of the October cold, into the warmth and the light and the sound of the family that had grown from a dead lantern and a dark mountain, and the particular courage of two people who had found each other and held on. The fire burned in the old stone hearth that Caleb had built 25 years before, and the shelves that lined the walls held the accumulated books of decades, and on the mantel, in the place where it had always been since the first winter, sat a small oval brooch carved from elk bone, a mountain landscape worked in fine detail, a moon above the summit, the first gift he had ever given her, worn smooth at the edges now with years of handling. Mary hung up her coat on the hook beside Caleb's and looked around at the room full of people she loved, and felt the vast and ordinary completeness of it, the kind of happiness that has no dramatic edge because it has been lived into so fully that it has become the ground itself. The ground you walk on every day without thinking about it because it holds, because it was built well, because the person who built it knew what he was doing and never stopped taking care of it. Outside, the Colorado mountains were dark and cold and full of stars, and the trail that led down to Elkhorn Crossing was invisible in the October dark, and there was no reason to find it tonight, because everyone who mattered was already home.